See You on the Weekend. This is an ongoing series of lectures that features some of the most exciting research and creative work being done by CU Boulder faculty members. Today's lecture is titled, What Do You Do When the Earth Shakes? Children, Adults, and Generational Gaps in Protective Action Behavior. Our speaker is Professor Lori Peak, who will be introduced more thoroughly in just a few moments. My name is David Means, and I will be your moderator. I am the director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which puts on this series. So before we dive in here, a few logistics before we start. We're together both in person and online. There's a audience that is not visible to us here in the room. In this hybrid format we're doing, we're really thrilled to be able once again to be doing See You on the Weekend in person, while also using virtual technology to include as many people as possible who couldn't reach the building today or might be in a distant place around the world. So last month we had approximately 100 virtual attendees and received a lot of positive feedback about the hybrid model. We're sticking with it. We'll continue to work to improve the format, and we appreciate your patience as we fine-tune some of the finer points. So there's still analog paper and turning of pages. Professor Peak will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for discussion and question and answer. Online attendees, you can submit your questions throughout the talk at any time using the question and answer or Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom window. When we turn to the Q&A and discussion portion at the end, we'll work to balance questions from folks who are in the room in person, as well as our online audience members. Online questions will not be visible to the other audience members on Zoom, so I'll be over here and I'll be reading those out to bring them into the space. So in-person audience members can raise a hand and we will bring you a microphone. This helps everyone in the audience to hear your questions and keep up with the discussion and to hear Professor Peak's responses. So please, if you raise your hand, wait for one of our staff members to run a mic to where you are. Closed captioning is available to those attending online. There's the CC button, which should also be at the bottom of your Zoom window. Click that and you'll see a live transcript that'll run as we go. The online version of the lecture is being recorded and will be made available on our website early this coming week. So for those of you in the room, we ask that you please silence your cell phones if you haven't already done that. Restrooms are down the hallway between the elevators and the stairs. If you go out those doors and out the doors to the main hallway there, straight back between the elevator and the stairs. All right, lots of logistics. That's part of this hybrid thing, right? It is my pleasure to invite Lori Hunter, Director of the Institute for Behavioral Science and Professor of Sociology, to come and introduce our speaker. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for being here and those online as well. So I'd like to start by extending my gratitude to the Provost and the Chancellor's Office and also the Division of Continuing Ed for sponsoring this series. What a great idea and an amazing way to connect to community. So I'm also honored to have been asked to introduce my dear colleague, Lori Peak. So Lori is the director of the Natural Hazards Center, which is in the Institute of Behavioral Science. She's also a professor of sociology here at CU Boulder. She's principal investigator of a National Science Foundation effort called Converge, which brings together data, people, trainings, all sorts of resources with regard to natural hazards. It's a real sort of hub for the natural hazards community. She also is principal investigator of what is called the Social Science Extreme Events Research Network. And I'll tell you, she is such a front runner. The NSF funds a lot of different research networks, and this was the first one on the social science dimensions of natural hazards. So Lori has studied disasters for more than 20 years. She has extensive experience in gathering data in the long-term aftermath of major events. I remember way back when she gathered data after 9/11 that led to an award-winning book called Behind the Backlash, Muslim Americans After 9/11. She has co-edited a collection entitled Displaced, Life in the Katrina Diaspora. She also co-edited the recent Handbook on Environmental Sociology, which is a tremendous resource for those in our field. Lori has also co-authored the book Children of Katrina and another entitled The Continuing Storm, Learning from Katrina. Lori also helped develop a FEMA training document called Safer, Stronger, Smarter, a guide to improving school natural hazard safety. So it's part of what we'll hear about today. I'm sure that was also related to a very powerful and I'm sure impactful New York Times op-ed that perhaps some of you saw on school safety. In 2021, she was nominated by President Biden and approved by the U.S. Senate to serve on the board of directors of the National Institute of Building Sciences. Again, a front runner. If my memory serves me correctly, she was the very first social scientist to be invited to serve on that board. So in addition to all of this amazing work on natural hazards, our students here at CU Boulder are super fortunate to have Lori Peak teaching the 400 student Introduction to Sociology course, an extremely dedicated educator and just an incredible opportunity for our students to learn from her. So overall, Professor Peak, I'm sure you can tell, is a talented, committed, passionate, impactful human being, both as a scholar, educator, and as a person. I'm thrilled she calls CU Boulder, the Institute of Behavioral Science, and the Department of Sociology her intellectual homes, and I'm really happy to welcome you to CU on the weekend.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy Saturday, and thank you for coming in from outside from what is a beautiful and glorious day to be inside of this beautiful room. It's really an honor to be with you, and I want to thank Lori. I could not be any more fortunate to have such an amazing director, former chair of the Department of Sociology, and just extraordinary colleagues. So thank you for that introduction. And thank you to Jeannie and Gretchen, David, the entire CU on the Weekend team who give up their weekends so that they can help bring knowledge and information to our community. So thank you very much. And welcome to all the people who are online, who are joining us in that format. And I am so excited to be with you today to talk about some research that my team and I have been working on related to earthquakes and protective actions. And I know in Colorado, it can feel like earthquakes are sort of this distant threat. But one of the things that I'm going to talk about today is how lessons that we've been learning in one hazard context are absolutely transferable across hazard contexts, including to floods, tornadoes, and other events. And so since you all are clearly great people who are interested in learning and are willing to give up part of your Saturday to be in this room, I figure you're all something akin to A+ students. And so we're going to start out with a quiz. And so David has the online folks, and we're really going to put them on the spot. And for those of us in the room, we're going to pose the following question. So David.
And that's a great point at which I can interrupt. And we've gotten comments from a couple folks who are online asking if you could speak more into the mic because they have their computer volumes at max and it's still a little low.
Oh, okay, absolutely. So I will even move up the microphone. So this is good because the people online hopefully can see this and can, if people are calling in, so they can hear this too. So the question is, what do officials in the United States currently recommend that you do in the event of an earthquake? So are you supposed to drop to the floor, cover, and hold on? Are you supposed to seek shelter in a doorway or other sort of stable space? Wait until the shaking stops, and as soon as it stops, get out of the building and get outside? Or are you unsure or something else? And so Jeannie and David are the folks online as the polls showing up for our Zoom audience. Okay, good. And then for those of you in person, I'm just going to do a little straw poll by a show of hands. And so who in here thinks that the answer is A? A couple of A's. Okay, who thinks the answer is B? Okay, lots of B's, the doorway. Okay, C, run outside. Okay, and then how about D? Okay, and then some Ds. All right. So, and now I'm gonna, okay, we can go ahead. I can see the results online. Can those be shared on the screen, or should I can just read them out too? So our online audience, thank you so much for participating. So they are very much reflecting what we saw in this room. So online, 8% of the folks said A, drop, cover, and hold on. 75% of the people online said seek shelter in a doorway. 8% also said wait until the shaking stops and then run out of the building. So a tie between A and C, and D actually. 8% also said unsure or something else. And so I'm going to now reveal the results of the quiz through showing you what the answer is rather than telling you what the answer is. And in order to show you what the answer is, I'm actually getting ready to show some live footage from the 2018 Anchorage earthquake. That it so happened when this earthquake happened, it was at the very beginning. It was right before 8:30 a.m. on a school day. And it so happened that there was a middle school class where they were doing presentations in the classroom and the teacher had a video running. And so you're getting ready to see the answer as told by the behavior of the real experts on the matter. The teacher's saying, cover your head. Is everybody okay? And this video goes on for almost 4 minutes. The shaking had stopped and the students stay under their desk until the teacher says that it's okay. And then they stand up and they calmly exit the room and then exit the building. And so the correct answer to that poll based on current recommended protective action guidance is that you are supposed to drop, cover, and hold on. Older guidance suggested that you were supposed to seek shelter in a doorway. And so now you can see too, when I refer to those young people as the real experts on the matter, I hope you can see their behaviors and how powerful they are. So why does this all matter? Why does this matter to us right here in Boulder, Colorado, or wherever you're tuning in from across the nation or around the world? So right now, according to the US Geological Survey, which is our premier federal agency in the nation that is tasked with geological science matters, some 143 million Americans in the contiguous United States are exposed to potentially damaging ground shaking effects in the event of the earthquake. And when we add in Alaska, Hawaii, and the 5 inhabited US territories, nearly half of all Americans live somewhere where they are at risk to damaging shaking in the event of an earthquake. In addition to earthquakes, as we well know here in Boulder, Colorado, earthquakes are certainly not the only natural hazard threat that we face in this nation. Floods affect all 50 states as well as all 5 of the inhabited territories. And in fact, floods are the most costly and most damaging natural hazard in our nation. Tornadoes are particularly damaging in the southeastern and midwestern United States. But again, as we know in Colorado, as recent experience in Windsor within the last decade taught us, Colorado is also subject to tornado threats. And on top of it, the wildfire risk is growing not only in the western United States, but throughout the rest of the US. And so 3 important facts that I think we all need to get our heads around given this ever more turbulent world that we live in. First is that disasters are now a shared experience. I know that in this nation right now, we have a lot of dialogue about what divides us. Here is one thing that unites us. There is no county or the equivalent of a county, a parish, in the United States that has not experienced some natural hazard event over the past 60 years. Every single county in the United States has experienced some natural hazard event. Now, the exposure varies dramatically, as do the damages that have been experienced across these counties, but no place in the United States is immune, and many places are actually subject to multiple natural hazards. Second fact, most Americans are unprepared for these escalating threats that we now face from natural hazards. So consider the following. Representative samples of Americans have shown that more than 70% of Americans don't even have a plan. So they don't have an emergency plan. They may not be aware of the different natural hazards that they face. They don't have a reunification plan of what would happen if they were separated from their child, from their parent, or from a loved one. 40% of Americans say they don't even have the basics of emergency supplies available to them, and less than half have any emergency cash on hand. And this is absolutely understandable given what's also happening in this nation of not only are we seeing rising natural hazards threats, we're also seeing rising social and economic inequality, where more and more people are struggling to make ends meet. More and more people are facing food insecurity, job insecurity. And so of course it makes sense that they may not have stockpiled food and water and extra cash on hand, a full tank of gas in the car to flee in the event that something happens. We also know that only about 1/3 of all parents report having ever talked to their children about natural hazards preparedness or about what they would do in the event that the family was separated in a major disaster. Third fact, that we know from surveys that misconceptions, misperceptions, and dare I even say myths about disasters and about disaster behaviors abound in this nation. And there have actually been entire books that have been written about disaster myths and how they've been purveyed over the decades through mass media, through movies, Hollywood stories, and so forth. And so there are lots of myths that are out there, like that people will panic and loot in a disaster, when studies for decades have actually shown that rather than ripping the shirt off of your back in the event of a disaster, people are actually more likely to take the shirt off their back and give it to you. And so said differently in social science language, this is what we refer to as the altruistic or the therapeutic community, that when disasters unfold, actually we tend to see this helping behavior that really abounds in a disaster. But there are other misconceptions and misperceptions, and we actually, at the beginning with that quiz that I gave us online and here in the room, that's one of the big misconceptions when it comes to what are we supposed to do when an earthquake happens, that people continue to think maybe you're supposed to run outside, or you're supposed to get in a doorway, or you're supposed to do something that's called the triangle of life that I'm going to show you in just a minute. So again, the current best practice guidance for the United States, and mind you, different countries around the world actually have different guidance for what you're supposed to do in different hazard events, which is part of what leads to the confusion and the misconceptions and the misperceptions. But in the United States today, the best guidance that we have available is you're supposed to drop, cover, and hold on, just like that little boy is doing in that photo. But we know survey after survey after survey, we are not unique in this room or in the Zoom room, that misconceptions abound, and most people report that they actually believe you are supposed to get in a doorway, or you're supposed to run outside in the event of shaking, or you're supposed to do something that no matter what, emergency managers cannot get rid of this. There's this myth online that that a triangle will be formed in an earthquake, and you're supposed to get down next to a table or another building or another big structure like this, and that somehow you will be saved if something falls. But this triangle of life, emergency managers have been trying to debunk this for decades, but it continues to sort of rear its ugly head online, even though, again, research has really shown that the best thing you can do to protect yourself, your child, or someone else is to do exactly what that young child is doing and what we saw the young people in Anchorage do. And so it's really important to pause and say, these misconceptions can have serious, serious consequences. Lori mentioned at the beginning when she was introducing me that I have the gift and the blessing of teaching the big 400 student introduction to sociology class here at CU Boulder, which I love teaching it. And I learned so much from Lori Hunter about how to teach that class. And one of my mantras in that class that I always say to my undergrads is that research, it just may what research has taught us. So here's one thing that research has taught us that may just save your life or make your life better and less injurious in the case of earthquakes. So one of the best meta-analyses that's ever been done on earthquakes and earthquake injuries as well as deaths in the United States actually found that those who were moving, so those who were trying to get outside, trying to run during an earthquake, were actually twice as likely to suffer a moderate as well as a severe injury in the event of an earthquake. Thankfully, large-scale damaging earthquakes are relatively rare in the United States, but when they have occurred, researchers like Kim Schoaf and her colleagues who were the ones who did this big meta-analysis, they go back through, they look at things like hospital data, injury data to try to learn lessons like this, so then we can bring them back to the public to try to, again, use research that will actually save your life or make your life better. How does this relate to us here in Boulder, where flooding as well as fires are two of our biggest hazards threats? So according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the nation's premier agency, public health agency in the United States, according to the CDC, almost half of all flood-related drownings in the US occur when a vehicle is driven into hazardous floodwaters. And this is, again, at sort of the aggregate level, at the national level. When you look at state level data, in many states, the statistics are much more shocking and more severe. Consider in the state of Texas, which is one of the most flood-prone states in the entire United States, some 75% of all people who perish in flood-related drowning incidents in the state of Texas, it's because they didn't adhere to that turnaround, don't drown. And what we know is that people see floodwaters and they oftentimes think that the cars can navigate those floodwaters, or they're not able to understand how deep the water actually is. Our depth perception gets really off really fast in flash flood events. And also we know that a lot of times flash flood events are accompanied by debris flows. This is a photograph from the 2013 Boulder, Colorado floods, which still stand as one of the most catastrophic events in our state history. 4 people died here in Boulder. 2 of the 4 people who perished in Boulder perished in one of these turnaround, don't drown incidents. They were 2 teenagers who were in a car who were heading to a birthday party. And their car was struck by a debris flow as they were trying to navigate these floodwaters. So again, research, it just may save your life. And if it doesn't save your life, we hope it can make your life better. Okay. So what and who is missing from the research on protective actions in disasters? Lori mentioned at the beginning that a lot of my research has actually focused on the long term after disaster, that I spent more than a decade after Hurricane Katrina with my colleague Alice Fothergill, who's also a proud CU Boulder graduate, as am I. We followed children and their families for almost 10 years after Hurricane Katrina. But one of the things I'm also interested in as a sociologist who studies disasters, in addition to that long-term, how do disasters unfold in people's lives? I'm also very interested in what happens in the moment of disaster and how do people respond and how is that response shaped by our social context as well as our socio-demographic characteristics, our age, our race, our gender, our social class status. And so one of the things as sociologists, not only are we sort of always interested in, we're trying to find patterns in the social world so we can understand how our social world is shaped and how it operates. But we're also very rightfully concerned with different groups of people in our social world, what they know, what they do. And one of the things, as somebody who's dedicated a big part of my career to understanding the experiences of young people, we know that the voices of young people have long been missing in disaster research. And so over the decades, we've learned a lot about children's mental health, for example. But what we've learned about children's mental health has largely been based on so-called parental report or teacher report. And so we go to the parents and we say, how is your child feeling? How is your child doing? How are they behaving after the disaster? And of course, parents know a lot about their kids, as do teachers, but they sure don't know everything. And so there's been a big movement over the last couple of decades to say, yes, we need to continue to learn from the adults in children's lives, but we also need to learn directly from children. We need to learn about what they're thinking, what they're doing, how they're behaving in extreme events. And that was part of what motivated the research study that I'm going to share with you with my remaining time today. And so what and who are missing? Children are oftentimes missing from the discourse, even though they are oftentimes listed among so-called vulnerable populations in disasters, but their voices aren't always heard. And so at the root, my research team and I at the Natural Hazard Center, we wanted to answer this question. What do adults as well as children, what do they actually do in the moment of earthquake? And as I mentioned earlier, thankfully in the United States, big, major catastrophic earthquakes are relatively rare. The last two really, really big earthquakes that actually struck the United States that caused multiple billions of dollars in losses as well as several deaths and injuries were actually the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, and then which struck the San Francisco Bay Area. For those of you who are old enough to remember this, the World Series was going on during that. And then the other big one, which one followed the here are my earthquake junkies in here. What was the 1994 earthquake that struck Southern California? Anybody remember? That was the Northridge earthquake. And so think about 1989 and 1994, my students that I'm teaching today, they weren't even like a glimmer in their parents' eye at that time. Like they weren't even born. And so those big events happened in 89 and 94. But then in 2018, Anchorage, Alaska, which is a very earthquake prone area in our nation, was struck by a major event. And in 2019, Ridgecrest, California, which is a couple of hours outside of Los Angeles, also experienced several damaging earthquakes. And so my team, with the support of the US Geological Survey, we said, we have to learn from these events because they were big events. They didn't get a lot of social science attention because they actually didn't cause a lot of death and injury. But as I'm going to talk about in a moment, they did cause a lot of damage to schools and to school buildings. And so our team really mobilized and wanted to learn. And so this is a picture of our team. Lori knows all of these folks very well. And so that's me on the, I guess I'm on your left. That's Dr. Rachel Adams, Jolie Breeden, and Dr. Jennifer Tobin, who are all researchers at the Natural Hazard Center. And we, if you don't believe that we are brave souls, we went to Anchorage, Alaska in January of 2020, and it was cold, maybe the coldest place I've ever been. We went to Anchorage in January of 2020, and then we were in Ridgecrest in February of 2020. And then, of course, you all know what followed that in March of 2020. So this was actually the last field research that my team and I engaged in before the global pandemic shut us all down. And so we went to Anchorage, Alaska, and we went to Ridgecrest and Trona in California. And so just to say a little bit about the research sites where we did the work. And so Anchorage is actually one of the biggest and most racially and ethnically diverse school districts in the entire United States. And it is bordered by what is fondly called the Matsu Borough School District. And so these two school districts were of great interest to us for a variety of reasons. One, because the earthquake that happened there in 2018, it was actually followed by hundreds of recurring aftershocks, and it damaged all 92 of the buildings in the Anchorage School District, and that impacted nearly 46,000 students and caused somewhere between $25 and $50 million in damages to the school district alone. And then in neighboring Matsu Borough, all 47 schools in that borough were damaged, and about 19,000 students there found their school year disrupted. And so we went to Anchorage and Matsu Borough, and then we followed that again with a follow-up study in Ridgecrest, Sierra Sands, and Trona school districts in California. And so that earthquake sequence actually happened over the 4th of July weekend in 2019, and it caused widespread infrastructure damage as well as power outages in Ridgecrest. 2 schools in the Sierra Sands Unified School District actually had to have their school year delayed. And in Trona, which is a very small community that's about 20 minutes away from Ridgecrest. So this earthquake got named after Ridgecrest, which is a bigger community. Trona is a much smaller community. It's actually a major environmental injustice community. There's a lot of issues with toxic contamination in that community. Many of you have probably heard of Erin Brockovich and all of the work that she did. Trona is one of the communities that's nearby where Erin Brockovich sort of started a lot of her environmental justice work, and Trona was actually cut off for several days from food or water, and it's a very small district, and the high school actually had to be red tagged and permanently closed. And so by the time we were there, they had actually merged the elementary school, middle school, and high school all into one building, which was creating all kinds of challenges in terms of having children from age 5 all the way up to age 18 in one building. And so what we wanted to do for this research, again, we were very interested in the protective actions and trying to understand what children as well as adults did. And so, because we live in a world now where, just like right now, almost everything we do is being videotaped. And so we had an opportunity to observe video surveillance footage in the schools. We had also the opportunity to look at emergency planning documents and to understand how drills were actually carried out in the various school districts where we were doing the work. But then we also did interviews with 118 adults as well as children in these school districts. And we focused on school administrators, teachers, emergency managers, but also we interviewed parents and others who had caregiving responsibilities. And then we also interviewed young people doing focus groups and other things in the various school districts where we were working. And so what did we find? And so we found 2 clear patterns in terms of protective action behaviors by age group. And after that little quiz that we did at the beginning, this may not surprise you, the 2 clear patterns. And so here's one, a student sort of speaking to what they did in the earthquake that happened in 2018. So this student said, so it started shaking, and I'm pretty sure everyone in the entire classroom was just like, duck and cover. And everyone just ran under the tables. Everybody did it at the same time. I'm pretty sure everyone knew it was an earthquake, so everyone ducked and covered. An adult, and all of the adults that we interviewed in both of the contexts affirmed what we heard from the young people, which is young people did the right recommended protective action. So this teacher and parent said, my littlest one, my youngest child, responded perfectly. Obviously, they're telling children in the elementary schools to take cover when the shaking starts. She did it without even being told. So at least at her school, they told them. And so again, both the young people as well as the adults, they said the kids did the right thing, whether they were in school, wherever they were, they knew to drop cover and hold on, and they did it quickly and they did it appropriately. Now, what did the adults do? So here's some of what we heard from an emergency manager in Alaska. We saw in this earthquake that adults definitely did not know what to do. They're running out of buildings. They're standing in doorways. One place I went to said all 4 people stood in the doorway in their office, and I'm like, okay. And so this emergency manager, this is what he does. He goes around to schools, he goes around to businesses, he goes around and he tries to train people what you're supposed to do in the shaking. And he felt like before the disaster happened, like my community is prepared. After the disaster happened, he was like, what is going on? The adults didn't do what it was that we were training them to do. And so a teacher in California, we thought, oh, maybe California is different. They have so much earthquake activity. Found a similar pattern in California. We were sort of like, oh my God, what's going on? So she's talking about when the first earthquake happened in the Ridgecrest sequence. They tell you to drop underneath your desk, but what, 6 or 7 seconds? You don't have enough time to process. Oh, it's an earthquake. Get under your desk. It's over before you even react. So we can all prepare all we want. And so again, the adults in both of the communities, they both said like, we either didn't have enough time, we weren't ready, we didn't process it, we didn't do it. So we found this really bifurcated pattern in the communities where we were working. And so then we dug deeper in the interviews and the video footage we were looking at to try to understand and to explain these patterns in behavior. And so now I'm going to tell you sort of the 6 things that we learned from the research that we think helped to reveal why were there these generational differences. And so the first had to do with training and the importance of drills in the schools as well as in the community. And so with the training, we found that the children, again, they really followed the current best recommended protective actions, what they were learning in their educational programs in the schools, as well as the drills. But then the adults, even though many of these adults were teachers and school administrators, and they'd gone through the training as well, they talked about how they reverted to what they were trained to do when they were children, which wasn't the same as what we're currently training children to do. And so when we talk to the kids in the study, as well as the adults, they use words like this, that it's ingrained in us. This is what we know to do. It was almost instinctual, that it was automatic. We just got under those desks, and you saw in that video, it sure did look automatic, didn't it? But one of the things that we know, this isn't an instinct. This is something like anything else that is taught and is socialized over time, but it has been socialized for these kids since such a young age that it came to feel instinctual, and it was part of their muscle memory, was another word that an adult used to talk about the kids. Here's how the adults talked about themselves and what they did and how their prior training shaped what they did in the earthquakes. And so a school librarian told us this. She said, I get in the doorway from the back of the room to the hallway because I was just like, oh yeah, I'll go stand where I'm supposed to be. This is how we were trained when I was young. Go stand in the doorway. That was old school. But now it's like, we need to know because things have changed. And my mind, it immediately went back to what you were supposed to do when I was a kid, not what you're supposed to do now that we have more information and we know more. And so the adults, especially the adults who worked in schools, they were really, really hard on themselves, and they were really reflective, like the school librarian, that she was trying to understand. I went through all the trainings with the kids. I knew I was supposed to drop cover and hold on, but when that moment of the shaking came, what kicked in for her was what she was trained to do when she was a kid. Okay, second, we know through social science research that people, especially when they're in community, they do not make decisions in isolation. They look around, they look at what others are doing, and they oftentimes make decisions about how to behave based on how others around them are behaving. And so this also played out in the earthquakes. And so in the context of both Alaska and California, the young people talked to us and they said, not only have they been trained, they've done the drills so frequently that they just knew to drop cover and hold on. And even if they felt a little bit scared, because all of their peers around them were doing the right thing, it helped them to do the right thing. Adults, on the other hand, they oftentimes pause. They look to others, they look to see what they were doing before they took action. And so a teacher in Alaska said that. She said, the kids got underneath their desks. They sort of followed each other's leads on that. And it was kind of fun to go back and to watch the surveillance videos to see what was going on, to see the people's reactions. And so the adults, they saw, they knew what the kids were doing. But then when it came to the adults, this is a school staff member in California who we interviewed. She said, I was up in the conference room. We were getting ready for a meeting and we felt it. We felt the shaking. I just looked up and I was like, what's everybody else doing? And then nobody else was under the table. And we were just like, is it done? Are we good? And so what she's talking about and what she's describing there is sociologists for decades, we actually call this milling or milling behavior, where people pause in the moment of a disaster and they look around to see what people are doing. And so we know that peers matter not only for young people, they matter a lot for adults too. Third pattern that we found in the data that shaped how people behaved and when they didn't always follow the recommended protective actions was related to mixed warning signals. And so during the Anchorage earthquake in particular, because school was actually in session and for several of the schools had already started the school day, for some of the schools that we visited and some of the administrators we talked to, they said, we actually ended up running out of the building, even though we knew that wasn't what we were supposed to do. But we did that because when the shaking started, it actually triggered the emergency alarm system. And then people got confused about whether they were supposed to run out of the building because is there a fire that's happening? We also know that context matters so much. In one of the high schools that we visited, there was actually a wall that wasn't constructed appropriately and it collapsed in the earthquake. And so when that wall collapsed, the teachers as well as the children got very scared and they were like, we don't know what's happening. Is this building coming down? And so when we looked at the video surveillance for that school as well, that was one of the schools where the children fled out of the school. And so we can think about, again, people may know what they're supposed to do, but our surrounding environment matters a lot in shaping our protective actions. Fourth pattern that we found, competing priorities. This is something that sociologists in every intro to sociology class ever, we teach about roles that people have in the world. You may be a professor, a mother, a colleague, a daughter. So we have social roles in the world, and sometimes our social roles are in conflict. And we found this too in the earthquake research that we did. And in particular, this was true for women in our study who had caregiving responsibilities as well as professional responsibilities. And so a lot of times what the women reported to us is that they knew what they were supposed to do, but they weren't going to do it until they knew that their child was safe. And so this is a school administrator. She talked about her children, plural, so the children in the school, and why she didn't take the recommended protective action because she was trying to care for the children in her charge. So she said, my response was to look around for the kids to see how the kids were doing. That's my primary focus, no matter what happens. There were a group of kids that they hadn't got to their classroom yet, so they were in the passing period in the hallway. And so she said, I just moved them away from the glass. There were glass windows in this passing period hallway. And she said, I had them stand up against the wall and stay as close to the wall as possible. It wasn't long, but it felt like forever as she was talking about the shaking. But then she said that was why I wasn't able to take the protective action, because I was trying to protect others. Fifth, we also heard a lot of stories on the ground, both from the people we interviewed, but also from the people they knew, about how a lack of experience with local hazards shaped protective actions that were or were not taken. And in particular in Anchorage, which is a big, actually both, interestingly, both of the communities that we were working on were big military communities. And so there's a big military base in Ridgecrest, California, which was actually closed down as a result of the earthquakes. And there's also a large military installment in Anchorage. And so there are lots of people who are not born and raised in Alaska or in California who are coming and going. They're transplants from other places. And because many of these adults did not grow up in so-called earthquake country, they weren't always aware of what they were supposed to do. Many of them had never experienced a big earthquake before because, again, these are relatively rare, thankfully, in our country. And so one of the teachers, a seasoned veteran teacher, native of Alaska, she talked about what happened with a young teacher who taught in the classroom down the hallway from her. She said she was terrified when the shaking started in the Anchorage earthquake. She grew up in Georgia. She came here from Hawaii. We have done the duck cover and holds and those things before in school, but she was so flustered. She thought that maybe a bomb had hit the school. And you saw that video and that shaking and how scary that is. So this teacher was terrified. She didn't know earthquakes that could be that big. She was so scared. And then I heard her screaming my name. And so she was screaming this other teacher's name. And this teacher called out to her and she said, "Come in here, come in here." And she managed to dive over everything that was already on the floor, that had fallen on the floor, and to get under the desk with this other teacher. I just don't think she was prepared for how big an earthquake can be. And so this is, again, like, you can do all the drills, but in that moment, this is how we saw this sort of this variability in behavioral reaction, especially among adults, and especially among adults who maybe didn't have that training and definitely didn't have that experience. Finally, sixth pattern that we saw that was related to the fifth pattern that shaped the protective actions that were not taken was related to emotions and emotional responses. And so some of the adults in the study, they talked about how the stress and the fear and the other emotions that they were feeling in the moment of the earthquake really overwhelmed them and affected their ability to respond effectively. And again, teachers in the study were especially critical on themselves when they weren't able to take the right protective action because of the incredible responsibility they feel for their kids in their classroom. Some of the children told us, "Oh no, we weren't scared at all." Adults said they were scared. We take the kids at their face value and what they actually did. And one of the most heartening stories that we heard in Anchorage, some of the kids were in one of the schools that we visited were in a big open gymnasium where they didn't have desks to get under. And in the case of a room like that, you're supposed to get to a wall and get up against it. And these three little boys who we interviewed in the school, they said that one of their fellow classmates actually froze when the shaking started and was just like, didn't know what to do. And they helped the classmate get up against the wall. And so the kids said, again, we go through the drills, we do the training, we were ready. So last, one of the things that we found that was perhaps one of the most concerning things that we found was about how much context matter in terms of where kids were when the earthquake happened and what happened between school and home. And so in short, this was the takeaway. When kids were at school, they were there, they had the desks, they were where they were doing the drills, they did the drop, cover, and hold on. But then we found that when they were at home, that oftentimes there was a strong influence of the parents. And because the parents oftentimes had different ideas about what was supposed to be happening in the earthquake, that they were much more likely, even if the kid was trying to drop, cover, and hold on, the parents were much more likely to literally report to us that they grabbed their kids and tried to get them to run out of the apartment, the house, wherever they were. And so at home, this influence of the parents sometimes changed whether or not the children took the recommended protective action that they had been trained to do at school. And one of the emergency managers, another one who we interviewed in Alaska, spoke to us about how hard this was to learn this as they were doing sort of their postmortems after the earthquake. So this emergency manager, she said, we're at one of the schools and we would sit and talk to them, to the kids as well as the teachers, about the earthquakes and stuff. And we were talking to them about the drop, cover, and hold. And I asked a kid, what do you do during an earthquake? And he said to me, well, at school, you drop, cover, and hold on, but at home, you get in the doorway. And I said, what? And he said, I talked to the kid and whatever, and throughout the summer, that repeatedly. I think that what I came to realize is we need to educate the parents more. And so to bring this to a close. So after doing this research and feeding this research back to the emergency managers as well as the school officials, our team developed 5 key recommendations that came out of this work that I want to share with you. And so first is that it is absolutely vital that we include all adults, school staff, parents, and community members in school-based drills. As we talked a lot about how children and students, they are the focus of these drills that are either recommended or required in the states that we visited. But a lot of times the children are the focus of those drills, and the adults are not always the focus of the drills. And so one of the takeaways of this work is that we think that it's absolutely vital, because drills are social processes, that we need to make sure and involve and engage the adults and make sure that they know these drills are for you too. They're not just for the children in the school. Second recommendation, we need to practice these drop, cover, and hold on drills in school as well as in the home and in other settings that include targeted and enhanced education for the adult school staff as well as for parents and others. How many of you know, just 2 days ago in this nation, as well as around the world, we observed the Great Shakeout. Many people agree that the Great Shakeout, it may be the world's largest earthquake drill. It started in California, and it has actually grown into this global event that happens on the 3rd Thursday in October across our nation and around the world. And some estimates suggest that some 50 million people take part in the Great Shakeout. And the Great Shakeout is all about doing that. It's about trying to get people to all at the same time at 10:20 a.m. on October 20th, in this case, that we practice the drop, cover, and hold on drill together. But again, one of our arguments is that there needs to be this sort of enhanced and targeted messaging for different age groups. Third, one of the things that we've learned and we've seen across the school districts that we've been working in Alaska and California, as well as in many other school districts, is that earthquake education, as well as other natural hazards education, where does it get scuttled aside to? Oftentimes to the earth science or the geography class, and it's sort of put in the capital S science class. But we know that what turns a natural hazard into a disaster, it isn't necessarily just the physical process, it's the social process. It's when we don't have strong buildings, and it's when we don't have strong communities where we work together and help each other and support each other. And so one of our recommendations is to, especially as we live in an ever more turbulent world, is we need to move that natural hazards education. We need to keep it in geography and geological science classes, absolutely keep it in those capital S science classes, but we think it needs to be moved throughout the curriculum. So in our social science classes, in our behavioral science classes, in all of our classes, that we're thinking about disasters and what they mean for our everyday life. Because disasters are no longer just these low probability, high consequence events that may affect us at some point in our lifetimes. With climate change and other speeding up of environmental change and environmental processes, disasters are becoming the norm in our society. And so the more that we can do to sort of mainstream disaster education and disaster preparedness, we know that rather than scaring people and terrifying them, it can actually help them to be ready and to feel a stronger sense of self-empowerment and readiness. Fourth recommendation is that future earthquake education programs could actually be more connected to recent scientific advances. So again, show of hands, and I hope our online audience will know this, is that in the United States, just over the past couple of years, we have joined other countries around the world in that we now have earthquake early warning in this country. And so the states of California, Washington, and Oregon, if you are there, or even if you're here, you can download an app on your phone, and you can actually, if a big earthquake is coming about a magnitude 5.0 or higher, you can actually get an alert on your phone now that may give you somewhere between 5 seconds to 60 seconds of an advance warning. And on your phone, it will say something like earthquake is coming. And you'll see that. And depending on where you are, if you're in your car, if you're in a classroom, a building like this, if you're at work, that's going to at least give you those vital few seconds of warning. But guess what? If you don't know what to do, and if you don't have the muscle memory built in, what are you going to do? You may freeze in place, you may try to run to a doorway, or you may try to run outside that building, and you may get hurt. And so right now, as our technological advancements are forthcoming, and we're getting amazing things like earthquake early warning in the United States that can not only just warn us on our telephone with an app, it can also stop trains. If somebody's doing surgery in a hospital, earthquake early warning can actually help doctors and nurses to stop that surgery and again, save lives. And so earthquake early warning is this incredible technological advancement that has been decades in the making. But where we're lagging behind is in the social science. We're only starting to do the research to find out, do people know that this app even exists? And again, do they know what to do in the event of an earthquake? And then fifth and finally, we need to recognize the power and influence that adults have over children's lives. So I'm going to bring this full circle to the turnaround, don't drown, and back here to Boulder, Colorado, and back here to the flooding threat, as well as the wildfire threat that exists in our nation. We know that women and children, research has shown that women and children oftentimes actually have quite high risk perceptions, but they don't always have control over what is happening in their environment. So think about if a child is sitting in the back seat of the car and says, Dad, Mom, put on your seatbelt. They can't always make the parent do the thing that they've been learning. Dad, Mom, put out the cigarette. Dad, Mom, turn around, don't drown. Dad, Mom, drop, cover, and hold on. Children do not always have the power, even if they have the knowledge, to get the adults in their lives to do what it is that kids are learning about in school. And so we need to recognize that power differential. We need to recognize when there are generational gaps in terms of these protective actions. We need to recognize what's driving those generational gaps. And sometimes it's not that there's anybody is bad that's out there. It may just be that they learned a different lesson. But right now we're living in an era where it is vital and it is urgent that we learn these lessons together. And so with that, I'm going to draw this to a close. Thank you for your time and attention and for your care today. Thank you for listening both in person and online. And now we have about 20 minutes or so for questions, answers, comments, anything that you would like to do in the remaining time. And thank you so much for your time today. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. So again, the way that we'll do this is if you are in person here, feel free to raise your hand, and Gretchen, who's lurking here in the wings, will bring you a microphone so you can ask your question into that. If you are online, there is that Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom window. Send those in and I will ask some of those as we have time.
Thank you. And thank you. And Gretchen, we have our first hand up. So thank you.
That was a very helpful presentation, but I looked around this room and the only person that I saw that had an area that you could go under is right over there. So what would you do in this room if it happened?
Yes, so wonderful question. I will repeat the question to make sure our online audience could hear it. So great question. So and it gets at our context. So the question was, okay, you told it we're buying in, we're supposed to drop, cover, and hold on, but there's like one table in this room. Are we all going to battle for that table? And so, and I'm gonna even take your question and double down on it, which is, what if somebody in this room has a mobility challenge where they're not able to drop, cover, and hold on? Because it's no easy thing to get under a little table like that. So this is where I'm going to shout out that Great Shakeout again, that the Great Shakeout website is fabulous because they have sort of, okay, the general recommended protective action is wherever you are, drop, cover, and hold on. And so they would say in a room like this, if you could get, even if you could get under a chair, again, I know fat chance if you have mobility issues to get under a little chair like that, but they would say get under anything where you can protect your head because that's where most of the injuries happen. So even if you can get under a chair, if you can get under a table, the next best thing is to get up against a wall and to move away from heavy things like this. So again, we would look around in the room and we might go over there to a wall like that, but we try to avoid if there's a speaker, a light. And this is very important actually in the context of schools, because when you think about schools, yes, there are lots of desks in schools, but there are also lots of big open air spaces like gymnasiums. And so that's the recommended action. If you can't get under a desk to protect yourself, get up against a wall and to look for falling hazards. If you have mobility issues, if you go to that Great Shakeout website, they actually talk about what you were supposed to do if you were in a wheelchair, if you have another assistive device, that there are special recommended protective actions for persons in that condition. Great question. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Great. So,
Go
don't
ahead.
interrupt.
Yeah.
A question that came in early on that maybe that's that is a good follow-on to what you've just spoken about. Is there an online forum for globally earned determinations on newest best practices yet?
Oh, I love this question. So the question was, is there a global, like an online forum for best practices? And in fact, I just worked with a group of about a dozen colleagues from around the world to draw together what are the recommended protective actions, because I am so glad to get this question, because drop, cover, and hold on is the current best recommended protective action in the United States. However, in other countries around the world, that recommended protective action varies. So for example, in Mexico, and in Mexico City in particular, which in 1985 experienced a devastating earthquake, Mexico actually has had earthquake early warning for many, many years. They have that technology that I talked about at the end. Mexico has actually had earthquake early warning available for a very long time, and the protective action that is recommended in Mexico is actually to run out of the building. And that's in part because of seismic safety standards in the United States are very different than in Mexico. And we have, especially in the state of California, far stricter and seismic safety guidance for our buildings. So buildings have been built to a stronger building code and standard, and or have been retrofitted over time. And so again, the best recommended guidance in the United States currently, stay in that building, drop, cover, and hold on. Then once shaking is stopped, calmly exit the building. That is not the recommended protective action the world over, because infrastructure varies, right, around the world. So Mexico has different guidance than what we have in the US. I'll say one more thing, and then I know Lori has a question. One of the organizations that I support and am a huge fan of is Geohazards International, which works in some of the most vulnerable, and here I'm talking about vulnerable both in terms of vulnerable infrastructure, but also marginalized people around the world. Geohazards International works in some of these contexts, like in Bhutan, in India, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, where again, people may not have safe school buildings, they may not have safe buildings. And so one of the things Geohazards International has done is said, okay, if the building isn't necessarily safe, could we work to build safe desks? And so the desks in the building would be safe, and could we train local people to build desks that would be safe and would withstand an earthquake, and even if the ceiling collapses and falls, that the children would be safe. And this incredible architect in Israel actually developed these earthquake safe desks that Geohazards International then partnered with this architect, and they've been building these desks in Bhutan for many, many years. And so now, and again, they're training local people, men and women craftspeople, to build these desks so that they're enhancing livelihoods, They're making sure that they're building local capacity and that there's local cultural buy-in to the intervention, and they're trying to save kids' lives and to make sure kids are safe. And so I love this question, and it gets up. We can stand up here and go, this is the best recommended protective action, but out of the other side of my mouth, you're also hearing me say how much context matters. And that's why know your context, know your neighbors, know what to do if you're at home, if you're at school, what if you're driving in a car? Be aware of these different things, think through these scenarios so you don't get stuck in the worst case where you freeze. Lori Hunter.
Well, first, thank you. I love hearing about your really important work, but my question was about infrastructure.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the seismic policies for California, but in addition to behavioral responses, how safe are our schools?
Oh, so thank you for asking that question. And I actually think this is one of the, this is a great, we talk about environmental injustice in the United States and environmental injustices. I think one of the greatest environmental injustices that we do not talk enough about is this combination between natural hazards threats, our infrastructure, and our most vulnerable children. And so in the state of California, for example, California is oftentimes touted as one of the most earthquake safe states, not just in our nation, but around the world. People turn to California to learn about their seismic safety standards. But there are many, many other schools in highly earthquake prone regions in the United States that are not safe. The state of Utah with the Wasatch Front, Barry Walliver is one of the nation's leading structural engineers, and he actually pioneered these rapid assessments of buildings. One of the things that they found in Salt Lake City and along the Wasatch Front is that there are dozens and dozens of schools that are in incredible risk to collapse and or to significant structural damage that will lead to serious injury or loss of life for, among children in Utah. In the state of Washington, Sandy Doughton is one of the nation's leading journalists who's been writing this seismic neglect series where she's been talking about what is happening in Seattle with the school buildings and how many old seismically unsafe school buildings there are in the state of Washington. And here's where it's an environmental injustice issue, that some of the most, they have mapped these school buildings, they know where they are, and who are the children who attend the most seismically neglected school buildings and the seismically unsafe children. They are low-income children and they are children of color who are predominantly concentrated in these buildings. And so Sandy Doughton has been writing tirelessly about these inequities in the school building. And now we're seeing in the state of Washington that we're starting to see some real policy movement to try to retrofit those buildings. But here's the challenge, that it takes time, it takes money, it takes vision, and it takes an investment of the community. And we've seen in the state of Washington, in the state of Oregon, which also Portland, many of the school buildings in Portland were built well before the city of Portland understood exactly how great their seismic risk is. And so as that risk has then become apparent, then it takes political will, it takes economic capital, it takes people who are willing to vote for school bond initiatives who may or may not have children in those school buildings. And what we've seen has happened in the state of Oregon and the state of Washington is oftentimes those school bonds come before communities, and there's all this grassroots movement to say children are, and our teachers are going to get injured or they are going to die in these earthquakes. Please, please vote for these bond initiatives. Sometimes they come through, sometimes they get voted down. And so this is a real challenge, and I'm very thankful that the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, which is a major, EERI is a major group in our nation that really has this policy advocacy committee where they follow state by state by state. They have a school safety initiative and they try to promote school safe policies, but it is an uphill battle that we're in right now because we know that many of these seismically neglected schools, they're also the same schools that teachers are going out and buying paper with their own money because they literally don't have paper in their classrooms. And so there are all other kinds of, just like in our nation as a whole, there are these kinds of immediate needs, right? That people are trying to meet their day-to-day needs in their classrooms, in their homes. But then when we ask, like, we have to invest in the future, in new school buildings or in retrofitting the school buildings that exist. And this is a hard battle, and it's a hard argument to be won, but it's just something that we have to keep making the argument if we believe in current and future generations and in keeping them safe. Yeah, thank you. It also gets at this question about there's no such thing as a natural disaster. There's a natural hazard of an earthquake, but it becomes a disaster when we have a vulnerable infrastructure and a vulnerable people. That's when that disaster unfolds. David.
So we have a two-part question from Doris online. What's the app called for earthquake early warning? And the second piece is, will earthquake warning be rolled out across the US? They know they used to live in New Jersey and they had an earthquake there a couple times.
Yes, and thank you, Doris, for that question. So first, the question about what is the app called? There are actually several different, again, this is the hard thing about public communication of science. There are actually several different apps, but if you just Google Shake Alert, then you will find the information about what is earthquake early warning, and it will send you to where you can download the app. So there are different apps depending on the state, like in California, you can use like the My Shake app, but I just say go to Shake Alert, just Google Shake Alert and it will come up and you can find the app and download it. And then the question about, is it going to be nationwide? So it has been, as I mentioned, decades in the making to get the earthquake early warning system that we currently have. And so I am not a geoscientist, but I would like to play one on TV. And so just briefly, here's what the geoscientists, what they have been doing. So literally for decades, they've been putting sensors in the ground. That's what it takes to get the earthquake early warning. So mind you, this is not a prediction system. We can't say like 2 months from now, the big one is going to hit X location in the United States. It's not a prediction system, but what it is, when an earthquake is triggered, it moves out from the epicenter, literally the shaking. There are P waves and S waves. And so the earthquake starts moving out from the epicenter, and depending on how close you are to the epicenter, if you are literally in this, what they call sort of the zone around the epicenter, you will get no earthquake early warning at all. But the further you are from the epicenter, that's where why there's the variability of, you might get 10 seconds of warning, or you might get 60 seconds of warning if you're quite far from the epicenter. But it's all about getting the seismometers in the ground, and that is very, very expensive. It's a huge investment from our federal government and from our tax dollars that has allowed this to be available in California, Washington, and Oregon. Doris, I'm very sorry, but it is probably going to be a long time before it is available in other locations across the United States. My understanding is that Alaska will likely be the next state to get earthquake early warning, but Alaska, for anybody who's ever been there, is enormous in terms of its land size, but also populations are relatively concentrated. So that's maybe the next location, but please don't quote me on that because nothing is clear about that, because this is, again, a big investment and takes a long period of time. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you say that these generational gaps also can exist in like tornadoes and other sort of hazards? And also would the key recommendations you provided kind of be able to be tailored to those disaster relief efforts as well?
That is a great question. So the question was, do these generational gaps exist in other hazards like tornadoes, floods, et cetera? And does sort of the recommendations transfer across hazard types? So I'll start with the latter part, I think, and hope that those recommendations would be transferable across hazard type. And I hope we'd see that kind of training. What is the best recommended protective action, regardless of your age, your life situation, your social category, et cetera? Do these generational gaps exist across other hazard types? We actually don't know. And in fact, in our Institute of Behavioral Science, a couple of years ago, we had one of the nation's leading, she's actually right here in Boulder, Julie DeMuth. She is one of the nation's leading weather researchers. And she got a similar question about tornadoes and like, what are kids doing in tornadoes versus adults? And after tornadoes happen, whenever there are deaths in tornadoes, there are actually field investigation teams that they go out and try to learn what were people doing. But Julie said this, and this is also my understanding of the tornado literature, that we actually don't know because people don't talk to kids, even though kids make up 25% of our population. But children, they're not in the room. It's a little harder to get approval from the institution to do research with kids. And so kids, they continue to be overlooked. So we actually don't know for sure, but I will tell you this, that about a year ago, I did this podcast with meteorologists, and they were sort of like, oh, they're thinking about weather, right? And I was talking to them about this research, and they were like, oh, earthquakes, that's not what we do. And then they heard this about the generation gap, and they said the same thing. They said, we see this all the time in communities where kids are learning one thing, but then the adults, they're either not listening, they don't want to do it, they maybe can't do it, whatever is going on. But the meteorologists, this definitely resonated with them. And so anecdotally, they said, we think something similar is going on with flood hazards and also tornadoes, but it's going to take more research. And again, it's going to take listening to kids, paying attention to kids, and paying attention to age, but also I'd like to say other life circumstances. So how is social class status? How is race? How is geographic location? How is time of day and other contextual factors shaping this? So thank you. Great question.
Thank you. My thought is so many of us are outside or in our cars.
Yeah.
So any thoughts about protective actions for that?
Yes. So the question was, so many of us are outside or we're in our cars. What about protective actions for that? So one thing I will say, and I learned this when I joined the National Institute of Building Sciences, that Americans, maybe this is an aggregate statistic I'm getting ready to throw at you, and maybe it's not true here in beautiful Boulder, Colorado, but according to the Environmental Protection Agency, Americans spend 90% of their time inside of buildings. Again, I know it's like, oh, I hope that's not true when you live in a place as breathtaking and beautiful as this. But according to the EPA, 90% of our time is spent inside of buildings. And so we need to know what to do in buildings. And again, we need to advocate and know, is the building where we're spending our time safe? Is it safe from different hazards, especially if we're a renter, if we're a school child or a parent? Are there things we can advocate to do to make that building safe? So we spend a lot of time in buildings. Also, I've heard before, again, that Americans spend so much time in cars, to your question, that we actually have more skin cancer incidents on our left arms than on our right because we're driving around so much. And so to your point, well taken, we spend a lot of time in cars. We also, some of us spend more time outside than others. So what are you supposed to do if you're outside or in a car? If you're in a car and an earthquake starts, you are to stop as soon as you can stop safely. So you definitely don't want to cause like a pile up of cars, but you are to stop and pull off the road as soon as you can. And this is again where infrastructure matters. In that Loma Prieta earthquake, a lot of you who again may have been alive during that may remember there was a bridge that collapsed during that earthquake and actually led to some of the deaths that occurred in that earthquake. And so stop your car if you can and stay in the car. Interestingly, one of the things we learned in that Anchorage earthquake, as dramatic as that shaking was, some of the people, because the area we were covering was so big, some of the people that were in their car and driving actually didn't know an earthquake happened because they were just driving along and they couldn't even feel it in the car, interestingly enough. But if you do feel the shaking, they said, we saw the lights moving and we didn't know what was happening. And then they pulled over and learned that there was an earthquake, which we thought was absolutely fascinating. So if you do know when it's happening, slow down and stop. If you are outside, it's a similar recommended protective action to being in a building. In some ways, being outside can actually be good for you if you're like in a field or an open space where you can just stop and take cover. Where it becomes dangerous if you're outside is if you are near a building, get away from it. The people who died or injured in the Nisqually earthquake in Seattle, one of the people who died, parapet that fell off a building and actually killed that person. And so if you are outside and you're near buildings, move away from the building and get into an open space as you can as soon as possible. Great question. And again, it gets at context matters and really like going through these scenarios. I know it can feel scary. A lot of times what parents ask me, because I study kids, they're like, should I talk to my kids or not? Should I talk to my grandkids? Like, what am I supposed to do? But here's the reality. Kids know about disasters. Who is it before the pandemic who they were marching in the street around climate action, right? Like kids know that disasters are happening. They know they're unfolding in our country. They're thinking about them. And one of the things that Alice and I, in our research after Hurricane Katrina, we started asking kids about this, about what they knew, what they wanted to know. And time and time and time again, what we learned from children was that they want to know. They know disasters are happening and that they feel a lot more sense of control and agency when they are educated. And when they aren't educated or when they feel like adults around them are hiding things from them, they actually feel much more scared and much less capacitated. And so there's now a lot of advice online about how we can talk to kids in age appropriate ways about the rising threats that we do face around us. So rather than creating fear and uncertainty, that we can actually create a sense of agency and hopefully certainty around kids and help them to navigate this ever more uncertain world that we do live in. Thank you for that question, and thanks to all of you.
So Professor Peak, since we are down to about 1 minute, rather than asking another question, there's several that would be very involved. Perhaps if you just have any sort of final words for the audience in the room and online in terms of the big takeaways that you would impress upon folks, or any sort of final remarks.
Yes, thank you. And just the final remark is always starting in with gratitude. So just thank you for being here today. Thank you for coming inside for your 90% of time in a building today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And I would just say, do everything you can to know your risks, do everything you can to get prepared, and recognize that one of the best things that can save us in a disaster is knowing our neighbors, knowing those around us, knowing those who may not have the resources or the capacity to prepare, and doing everything we can to try to support them and to support our communities and our institutions and our infrastructure to make it as strong as possible. And so that's where I'll end. And David, I know that you have some announcements, so I will turn my microphone off and turn it over to you. Thank you. Oh, thank you, everybody.
Wonderful, Lori. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. We are grateful for your time and your expertise, and there's a lot of preparation that goes into these things. And so we really, really appreciate you participating. So for everyone who joined us today in person and online, we thank you also for your time and attention. And the many excellent questions you offered. For those of you we didn't get to your questions, apologies for that. We hope that you will join for a future See You on the Weekend event and be part of those discussions down the line. So I would, Lori also mentioned the outreach and engagement staff. Big, huge thanks to all of you for making the event possible, all the logistics and planning, the marketing, the postcards that some of you have received. Sign up for our email list if you have not already to receive that information. Our staff makes it possible to get that information out. So let's see, I believe we have another slide right here. Oops. Maybe not that way. Oh. Is it? No? Okay. Sorry about that. Oh yeah, great. Thank you. So we have a couple other bits of information today to let you all know about. This is our final See You on the Weekend lecture of this series for fall 2022. Starting right now, well, just a moment, out in the Chancellor's Hall beyond these doors, we have a showcase of community engaged scholarship focused on climate change. Everyone who is here and your friends who are not here yet, but you can send them a text message, is welcome to join us out there for some light refreshments and a chance to speak with faculty and staff members about their work with communities in Colorado and beyond. See You on the Weekend will return on February 25th of 2023. Keep an eye out for forthcoming details on our website and via email and postcards that come in the snail mail. In the meantime, We hope that you will all take advantage of another opportunity coming to campus this semester. The Right Here, Right Now Global Climate Summit will happen December 1st through 4th. This promises to be a spectacular gathering focused not only on climate change and its disproportionate impacts on the most vulnerable, but on the many solutions that are also within our reach. You can learn more about the summit at the web page. Is it up on the screen? The next slide. There, it works now. Brilliant. The website, which you can see up here on the slide. So finally, we invite you to complete a brief survey on today's event. On the screen now, you'll see a QR code. If you have a smartphone, you can use the camera on your smartphone to scan that by holding up your camera to it. And you can complete a short online survey. We really appreciate feedback from you all. It helps us identify topics for future lectures, as well as to fine tune, as you see we're doing with the technology side, how we plan and present these events. So we have a couple staff members. If you have any trouble with the QR code, Gretchen's back there. She can help you with that. Or we also do have paper copies of the survey if you prefer that. Just make sure to hand it to us before you leave today if you fill out a hard copy. Our online participants, if you have not yet bolted, well, and even if you have, you can't hear me, but you will receive an email with a link to the survey. And again, we really appreciate that feedback on our See You on the Weekend events. So again, please stick around if you are able to check out the showcase in the Chancellor's Hall, and we look forward to seeing you all on the weekend again in the future. All the best.